Welcome to Judaism Demystified, a podcast for the perplexed. Join us as we explore some of the most fascinating Jewish and Torah-related topics with our esteemed guests. By tackling some of the biggest questions you likely won't find addressed elsewhere, we aim to shed light on important issues and inspire a return to the fundamentals. Enjoy the show. Thank you, Rabbi Eisen, for rejoining the Judaism Demystified podcast. We're so honored to have you back. We love everything you do, and we really just we're sorry that we're constantly badgering you to come on, but there's so many requests to have you on again. So thank you so much.
It's a blessing for me, so I'm very grateful to you for the invitation. Thank you for your hospitality.
So we have a series of questions and follow-up questions, but I'm going to just start with the first one, which is Maimonides' theological system in the Guide for the Perplexed relies on a medieval geocentric cosmology where providence, revelation, and miracles are mediated through the heavenly spheres and separate intellects. With modern science disproving the geocentric model, a theological challenge arises. A, must the categories of providence, revelation, and miracles be abandoned because the mechanism Maimonides posited no longer exists? B, alternatively, should a new metaphysical system such as that of Kabbalah be adopted to preserve these categories despite the serious theological problems Kabbalah introduces, namely its depiction of divine multiplicity and metaphysical complexity, in contrast to Maimonides' strict emphasis on divine unity and simplicity?
Okay, so I think the first place we should begin is, indeed, the question pertains directly to Rambam, while it's critical for us to appreciate we're not just going to be talking about Rambam. But with respect to Rambam, is it true that Rambam presents to us a system that weds physics and metaphysics? Yes, it is. Is it true that Rambam introduces arguments that pertain to the cosmology that was accepted at the time in the context of his sparring with Aristotle? It definitely is. However, is it true, therefore, that the whole system goes out the window, lock, stock, and barrel because we no longer subscribe to the cosmology? Of course not. I grant there is a far more subtle and sophisticated endeavor that is incumbent upon us. I like to liken it to microsurgery, because we need to tease apart the components that are based upon an obsolete physics and cosmology to which we unequivocally do not subscribe. Broadly speaking, we can note in Hilchot Yesodei Torah, much of Prakim Gimel and Daled, chapters 3 and 4, fall into that category. But does that necessarily mean that we jettison the metaphysics? No. And the metaphysics, of course, is primarily what Rambam presents in Perek Bet, chapter 2, which is, of course, intended to address the fundamental theological issues that need to be addressed. In Guide of the Perplexed, Rambam does so as well. But ultimately, when we consider the implications with respect to theology, the theology is not dependent upon the physics and the cosmology. And the theology can certainly stand even if the physics and cosmology are discarded. And it's, of course, important for us to appreciate this is something that pertains by no means to Rambam alone. We certainly see it enunciated by the gamut of the Rishonim, in the sense of the need to define a theology that is sound and categorically monotheistic, and simultaneously the extent to which, in varying degrees, and indeed among the Rishonim it certainly is in varying degrees, the extent to which this is on some level wedded to an Aristotelian natural philosophy. Natural philosophy is what has morphed into science. What we mean by science and what was intended by natural philosophy in the medieval period are two very, very different Weltanschauungen. I think a good way of expressing the difference is this is, after all, long before Galileo drummed into the scientific mind the need for empiricism. But again, this is that of course is a far broader issue than what we're addressing right now. It's critical for me to emphasize this is something that is enunciated not only by Rambam. Certainly, we see this in Rabbi Yehuda Levi and Sefer Kuzari. In varying degrees, we see it in Ramban. We see it in other Rishonim as well. Ultimately, we see it in Ḥazal. And it's important for us to appreciate this point because, on the one hand, if you're going to ask me to what extent do we derive a coherent theological system from Ḥazal, my response inevitably is to invoke three words in one of the most famous Hasagot critiques of Ra'avad with respect to what Rambam states in Hilchot Teshuvah in chapter 3, halakha 7, the halakha being where Rambam lists the various categories of sectarians, those who are considered minim and thereby forfeit their share in the world to come. And the third on the list is the one who believes in supposedly one God, but one God that is corporeal. And Rambam considers such an individual a min who has forfeited his share in the world to come. Ravad dissents, referring to gdolim v'tovim mimenu, which we could either render as greater and better than he or greater and better than we, but we're certainly presumably talking about some very holy people who embrace this view. The critical problem in the manner in which this comment of the Ravad is, unfortunately, almost ubiquitously misquoted, is the Ravad coming to justify that view? Categorically not. Because what he goes on to state is they came to this conclusion based upon what they saw in scripture, and even more so what they saw in Agadot, Hameshabshot et Hadeot. And those last three words are critical. Agadot, that confuse, corrupt the mind. And we should take Ravad's warning very much to heart. Obviously, Rambam appreciates precisely the same point and has designated a book to address the Rashot of the Chachamim and explain how to understand them correctly in his Mishnah commentary. Unfortunately, that book becomes one of the most important books in all of history that was never written.
Yeah.
So we don't have Rambam's guidance in telling us how to read Ḥazal, but the essential principle Rambam explicitly enunciates, that is, to read what Ḥazal are telling us literally, is a pathway that leads to the utter diminution of Torah and of us by completely misunderstanding what they're saying and what their agenda wasn't saying it. That is, these agadot that Ravad rather ruthlessly describes as corrupting the mind were clearly not intended to teach theology. And if they were just there for corruption, then we would ask why they're there altogether. They're there to engender emotions, to enthuse us in our divine service, but certainly not to learn theology from them. And anyone who attempts to learn theology from them is completely misconstruing their agenda and coming to conclusions that will be categorically heretical. It's important for us to appreciate that. And that's why we have the guidance of the Rishonim. And I can't emphasize this point enough. That's why we have the guidance of the Rishonim. The Rishonim were essentially the first, precisely because they were acting, flourishing, writing in a period in which Greek philosophy was already relatively accessible. In particular, of course, we're speaking of Rishonim Sfarad, where Arabic was the lingua franca, and the works of the Greek philosophers had been translated into Arabic roughly between the 8th and 10th centuries. And as a result, they appreciated the critical need to rigorously enunciate a theology of Judaism to combat that threat. To combat that threat, on the one hand, to not allow that threat to undermine our belief in revelation, and simultaneously, no less critically, to not allow the retort to that threat to produce some monstrosity in lieu of Torah that would indeed embrace views that are categorically unacceptable because they are theologically unsound. So again, to summarize, the way we need to relate to Rambam, and not just Rambam, but the gamut of the Rishonim, is, of course, they express themselves in the terms of their time. By the way, we do the same, just our time is different. But we give them the tremendous credit that they deserve for having mastered the science of their time, having mastered also the philosophy that was the antagonist to their faith, in order to be able to enunciate an understanding of Torah that would be timely in their time and cogent in responding to the challenges of philosophy. And of course, we need to do the same. And what we need to do with Rishonim, and of course, I reiterate this point over and over again because it's something that my life very much revolves around. We need to translate the Rishonim. I don't mean linguistic translation. I mean conceptual translation. Obviously, they couch their terms in terms that were relevant in their time. We don't live in the same time. But there is no period with which we bear a closer intellectual affinity than Rishonim Sfarad, because our principal challenge today is the challenge of a rationalist system that purports to do away with the need for and even justification of belief in revelation. And they did too. Just the rationalist system in their time was neo-Aristotelianism. The rationalist system today is what we could broadly describe as scientism.
Exactly.
It's a different challenge and requires, of course, a different enunciation of the principles of Torah. But we ignore the guidance of the Rishonim at our peril.
Thank you so
Because
much.
they provide us with the guidance. And
Thank you so
unfortunately,
much.
ignoring them in most quarters, we do.
Thank you so much for that explanation. I wouldn't even call it for that. Thank you so much for bringing shedding light onto the importance of understanding that the Rishonim were responding to their own to their own challenges of their time, just like we respond or should be responding to the challenges of our time. I do want to.
For us, it becomes a lot easier because we have their guidance if we pay attention to it.
Okay, and if we pay attention, we can model off of them into how we would model into how we would respond to today's challenges. That's fantastic. I do want to ask. At the very beginning, you mentioned that Rambam's theology does not necessarily need the Aristotelian system in order to stand. It doesn't need to stand on an Aristotelian system. I just wanted to know if you can demonstrate that a little.
So let me clarify that a bit further, because that's not precisely what I said. What I said was, it doesn't hinge upon Aristotelian physics and cosmology. There are definitely components of Aristotelian metaphysics that Rambam regards as sound. The question that we need to ask ourselves, and again, this is precisely why I speak of microsurgery, is to what extent does the metaphysics go out the window together with the physics and cosmology? So as a particularly significant case in point, we speak not only from a Maimonidean perspective, but certainly from a Maimonidean perspective, of the active intellect. And I'm emphasizing this point because I think there's a point of profound misunderstanding among many students of Rambam today. It is inevitably a challenge for us to recast the concept of the active intellect in terms to which we can relate, to be perfectly rigorous in the Aristotelian cosmological system. There is an incorporeal intellect associated with each of the cosmological spheres, and there is, to that extent, a series of spheres, if we can consider them concentrically moving in from the outermost all-encompassing sphere that is the sphere associated with the second cause, that is the first derivative cause from the first cause, which is the deity. So that's the first level, if you will, of incorporeal intellects that are derivative of the deity. And that's associated with the all-encompassing sphere. And then the next concentric sphere is the sphere of the fixed stars, then Saturn, then Jupiter, then Mars. There's a little bit of an ambiguity with respect to the order of the next ones, but the dominant view is the next one is the sun, and then Venus, and then Mercury, and then the moon. And then there is the sublunary realm. So if you've been keeping track of the numbers here, we're up to the 10th derivative cause, which is the active intellect. Now, if you ask me, is this part of Rambam's system? Just look in Hilchot Yesodei Torah, Perek Bet, Halakha Zayin. Rambam gives you a list of 10 levels of malachim that is precisely intended to be correspondent to the system.
Yeah.
If you ask me, do we subscribe, therefore, to the concentric spheres of Talmudic cosmology? Of course not. Does this metaphysical system necessarily go out the window because Talmudic cosmology goes out the window? Of course not as well. That is, the system ultimately is one that we can regard as sound, irrespective of the extent to which the fusion, the uneasy marriage to cosmology has been sundered and utterly annulled, but the metaphysics can still persist. And what, of course, is critical for our purposes, talking about the active intellect. The 10th level of Malachim, Rambam tells us at the end of Halakha Zayin, again, chapter 2, Halakha 7, is Ishim. Ishim, so called, because that is the level that communes with man. Now, we're not going to talk about sublunary realm here. The way I'll describe it is that there is the intellectual / spiritual content of our universe. That's the active intellect. Is that a concept that can be cogent without the physics and cosmology? Unequivocally. Does Rambam subscribe to it? And would he subscribe to it today? I have no doubt with respect to the affirmative answer to both of those questions. And again, it's important for us to appreciate what it gives Rambam. Now, with respect to how we relate to active intellect, this is a very complex question of understanding the Rishonim. Ultimately, the argument over the extent to which the active intellect serves in a mediating role is the subject of one of the most important foundational dissensions between Rambam and Ramban, in particular revolving around the beginning of Parashat Vayera. Ramban, in his commentary at the beginning of Bereshit, chapter 18. This is a very long comment of Ramban, and it's important for us to appreciate the domains in which he assents with Rambam and the domains in which he differs. On the one hand, the principle that if someone sees a malach, I hesitate to use the translation angel simply because we already have in our mind's eye something of an idea of what angels are based upon the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. No, they are not fat, naked babies with wings. They're incorporeal intellects. So says Ramban, it's impossible to see an angel with physical eyes because they are incorporeal beings, just as Rambam says. And yet there's a critical aspect of divergence. Rambam says that anyone who is described as seeing a malach is necessarily in a state of nevuah, of prophecy. Ramban says there is a lower level of vision that is adequate for being able to see a malach, to commune with malach, that is not identical with prophecy. And if you ask me what this dissension revolves around, there are other aspects of what they're discussing. Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim in the second unit in chapters 41 and 42, and Ramban again in the beginning of Parashat Vayera in his commentary on Bereshit chapter 18, verse 1. Again, there's a lot going on there. What I'm going to note for our purposes is what they have in common. And this is critical for us to appreciate this point. They both agree that there is a categorical divergence between the level of Moshe's prophecy and the level of everyone else. Moreover, they also both agree that prophecy is categorically distinct from what we describe, one could say, in the parlance of, if you will, Mizmor Nun Aleph, Psalm 51, but more critically in the parlance of the Gemara as Ruach HaKodesh. I'd rather leave that untranslated rather than say Holy Spirit, because again, we have associations with the English translation that would definitely be distracting. So they both agree that Ruach HaKodesh and Nevuah are categorically distinct. Indeed, both Rambam in the second unit of the Moreh in chapter 45, where he gives us a typology of levels of Nevuah, and Ramban in this comment utilize the example of Daniel as an exemplar of the level of Ruach HaKodesh as distinct from Nevuah. I'll note that Rabbi Yehuda Levi in Sefer HaKuzari, in the first Ma'amar in section 87, does the same. Is this something that is a unanimous consensus among the Rishonim? No, because there's still room to argue as to whether Ruach HaKodesh and Nevuah are separate categories in Ḥazal. There's definitely room to argue about it, simply because in the overwhelming majority of instances, Ḥazal use these two terms interchangeably. Tosefta Masechet Sota says, "Mishemetu neviim achronim, Chagai Zechar Malachi, nistalka Ruach HaKodesh miYisrael." So you see, they're talking about neviim, we're talking about Ruach HaKodesh. Same statement, still referring to the same thing. So whether Ruach HaKodesh is distinct from Nevuah is a machloket Rishonim, as a conspicuous case in point. The Meiri in his introduction to Sefer Tehillim dissents with regarding them as separate and distinct levels. We tend to think of Meiri as a Maimonidean, and here he equivocally dissents with Rambam. The reason I'm stressing this point is Ruach HaKodesh, I think, according to all those Rishonim who regard it as a separate level from Nevuah, would cast Ruach HaKodesh as a level of, shall we say, hypersensitivity to the spiritual, intellectual content of our universe, as opposed to a message from God. Nevuah is a message from God. I mentioned Rabbi Yehuda Levi, Rambam, and Ramban. I have no doubt that all three would completely agree with that statement. There's the additional dimension, besides the bifurcation between Nevuah and Ruach HaKodesh that we need to ask with respect to the Nevuah of Moshe. Is that something that is categorically distinct from all of the Nevi'im? And again, I'm going to state, according to all the Rishonim, unequivocally. How do I know? Because it's an explicit Gemara. Because the Gemara in Tractate Yevamot, page 49b, tells us all the prophets gazed through unclear glass and Moshe gazed through clear glass. And then we need to quantify what the nature of the distinction between these two levels is. So Rambam is far more focused on the critical importance of our appreciating that Nevuah is not actually bringing God into this world, but ultimately everyone would agree with that. Ramban, as a case in point, is far more concerned with emphasizing that not only Moshe, but also all other Nevi'im are getting a message from God. So he diminishes the importance of speaking about what is unequivocally the qualitative difference between the level of Nevuah of Moshe and the level of Nevuah of other prophets. But he certainly subscribes to the premise that such a qualitative distinction exists, just as unequivocally Rambam also maintains that Nevuah is, as opposed to Ruach HaKodesh, getting a direct message from God. Direct, not necessarily as in God being revealed directly in this world, but it is the content of the message is a message from God, even if it operates via intermediaries such as the active intellect. Now, if you're going to ask me, do we have to subscribe to there being exactly 10 levels of Malachim the way Rambam presents it? Maybe yes, maybe no. But the idea of, again, there being such a thing as receiving a divine message, there being a distinction between the level at which God communes with Moshe and he communes with other Nevi'im, and there being a lower level of revelation that is being resonant with the spiritual content of our universe as opposed to getting an actual divine message. All those distinctions, again, we mentioned Rabbi Yehuda Levi, Rambam, and Ramban. I'm happy to, with very great elaboration, prove that each one of them subscribes to all the premises that I just enunciated.
So you made a point to say not direct a few seconds ago, right?
Right, and again, that is, all of them would also agree that the level of revelation to all other prophets is qualitatively distinct from the level of revelation to Moshe. But they're still getting a message. It's not simply Ruach HaKodesh. Indeed, that's precisely the point, that all three, in different ways, stress that Ruach HaKodesh is distinct from Nevuah. What I'll add additionally, this is a point that of the three, Rabbi Yehuda Levi makes most explicit. Although, again, I'm still going to argue that all three subscribe to it. That what we mean when we talk about Ruach HaKodesh is what the Neo-Aristotelians mean when they talk about prophecy. If you want an excellent specimen of the idea of a prophetic voice among the philosophers, candidly, I have a very lengthy dissertation to present on the subject of the prophetic voice to which Socrates refers twice in his trial. But again, I think that would take us too far afield. What I'm stressing is the Greek philosophers had no idea of an affirmative message that comes from God. Socrates speaks of a voice, he calls it a voice, but a voice that dissuades him from doing what he shouldn't be doing. In other words, a hypersensitivity to going out of bounds, but there's no affirmative message. Nevuah is an affirmative message. Everyone who is faithful to Torah believes that, unequivocally. Rambam as well. Anyone who claims otherwise isn't reading Rambam.
Yeah, unfortunately, you may have just alluded to this, but there are, I appreciate you mentioning the Rishonim, because there's a tendency to say that Rambam is like a, dat yachid, he's a singular thinker, and like as if to say that he doesn't see eye to eye with the Rishonim and they don't see eye to eye with him. And I think that's
it's important for us to appreciate.
Yes,
you don't die of a machloket. That is,
yeah.
There are disagreements, but it's important for us to appreciate the disagreements are far more subtle than I suspect is generally conceived. If I may just interject a very recent citation, Rav Kook decried the superficiality of people who draw facile distinctions and cubbyhole different Rishonim in different categories without appreciating the nuances that, on the one hand, distinguish between them, but of course, on the other hand, in large measure, unite them. But of course, you only get a sense of that when you study them seriously. What he was decrying was the fact that in yeshivot nowadays, almost no one does. And the ones who do study them seriously don't have an agenda of avodah Hashem. Because, as I think we've noted in other contexts, the academy is academic. Academic is an adjective that has two meanings that might seem unrelated, but are inexorably conjoined, pertaining to the academy and divorced from the realities of life.
So
the Rishonim never wrote academic works. Their philosophy was all means to avodah Hashem, and they need to be studied that way. And that applies absolutely to all the Rishonim whom we've cited.
absolutely. So there's just one thing I want to get some clarity on, because the second part of the first question, which was about Rambam's strict emphasis on divine unity and simplicity, the question is whether a system like Kabbalah could be useful, because if you ask most, experts in Kabbalah, they'll say all this is metaphoric and so on. So what would be the issue? Where's it? Is there a distinction still?
What I'll note with respect to Kabbalah, I don't by any means pretend to be an expert on the subject, but first and foremost, it's critical for us to appreciate that Kabbalah is enunciated, formulated as means to avodah. Certainly taking it literally, it can by no means be the basis of a system of theology. But simultaneously, I'm not going to say that it is irreconcilable with the system of theology. It's only when you take it literally that it is that. So as a case in point, I'm going to note in particular, and I believe I've cited him in previous meetings of ours, one of the greatest Jewish philosophers of all time, who no one recognizes was a Jewish philosopher, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, the Rama, in Sefer Torah Ta'olah, which is one of the most profound works of philosophy I have ever read. And one of the agendas of the Rama, they didn't call him the Rambam of Poland for nothing. One of his agendas was not by any means, I'll even say, chas v'chalila, to read Rambam as if Rambam is a Mekubal. Rambam is not writing Kabbalah. But simultaneously, on the premise that Jewish philosophy is cogent, and the Rama certainly regarded as being so, and that the Kabbalistic system can also be cogent, there needs to be some way of bridging what seemed like an unbridgeable gap between them. And of course, inevitably, one of the most thorny issues is, what do we mean by sfirot? Obviously, if they are construed in any literal sense as pertaining to the realm of the divine, that's polytheism, chas v'chalila. And what the Rama proposes, an approach that I personally wholeheartedly embrace, is that we relate to the sfirot as ta'arei pe'ulot. Now, ta'arei pe'ulot is the concept, of course, that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi addresses in the second Ma'amar of Sefer Kuzari in Siman Bet, that Rambam addresses in the 50s, in the first unit of the guide, beginning in chapter 52. Ta'arei pe'ulot, as all the Rishonim recognize, will be multiple. It's describing God in terms of the manner in which we perceive his actions manifest in this world. So it doesn't, of course, in any way imply multiplicity in the realm of the divine. They're simply recognizing that we believe God acts, from our perspective, in a manner that we perceive in this world. And we describe the manner in which we perceive those manifestations using various adjectives, various divine attributes. Here we are, very much a time of year of focusing upon the Yud Gimel Midot HaRachamim. And they are, perhaps even in all, certainly the vast majority, Ta'arei Pe'ulot. You're describing God as compassionate, as forgiving. What do those words mean? They mean that we observe manifestations in this world of what we would describe, were we to ascribe those manifestations to a human agent, as being compassionate and being forgiving and so on and so forth. But we aren't in any way implying that this is an identification of chas v'chalila, some component part in the realm of the divine. That's a critical point for us to appreciate. And of course, to that extent, it's important for us to relate to whatever one chooses to appropriate from the Kabbalistic system in a manner that will indeed cohere with theology. So I certainly present the Rama's perspective as one that, to me, is not just compelling, but as a lifesaver. There could be other systems as well, but certainly to understand Kabbalah in a manner that contravenes the essential principles of irreducible, absolute divine unity and simplicity is something that we regard as heretical.
So I would say that most people, I don't want to spend too much time on Kabbalah, because the bulk of this really is we want to focus on Rambam and the Rishonim. But just on your point, 2 points actually. Most people that have a superficial or cursory or sort of you know, not fully informed or just a casual, let's say, acquaintance with Kabbalah, for the most part, people will employ that type of terminology and understanding. You ask, an average person who doesn't, study Kabbalah, but like, but has like it's in his tongue, but it's not something he's really delved into. Let's say these are the midot that we see from okay.
But it's, again, the critical question to ask is what
Not
do
the
you mean by
midot. No, they mean the actions. Which, yeah. What I'm saying is that a casual person, for the most part, would hopefully likely not go beyond that, because divine simplicity is something that is thrown in people's they're told about divine simplicity all the time, right? So
I would hope so. I'm not
no,
so
well,
sure that
no,
nowadays that still
even
is
the
the case.
Kabbalists do that, though. To be fair, the Kabbalists always try to differentiate between, they do. There is those differentiations that are put on the table. What I was going to say was that there's really two ways to go about Kabbalah. You can either try to discredit Kabbalah, or, like you just suggested, you can actually just repackage Kabbalah, like the Rama did, right, into a way which will not go into a heretical position and purport that understanding. What would you suggest?
I think on
What's
some
the best
level,
way to go about it?
so on some level, however pedestrian and cliche this answer might appear, different strokes for different folks. By which I mean, there are those who feel a tremendous resonance with Kabbalah, and I'm
Therefore,
certainly not
you
going to come to negate it, in particular once we appreciate that Kabbalah unequivocally has a venerable tradition. That is, Sefer Abahir is a work, granted, we can cast aspersions on its ascription to Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana, but it certainly is a very venerable, very old work. And we appreciate that the tradition of Kabbalah that Ramban, as a case in point, possessed, certainly did not begin with Ramban. We can, on some level, presumptively, trace it back from Ramban to Rabbi Yisrael ben Shlomo and Rabbi Yisrael ben Menachem, Talmidim of Rabbi Yitzchak Sagi Nehar, he himself being a Talmid of his father, the Ravad Baal HaSagot, he himself being a Talmid of his father-in-law, the Ravad HaSheni. It's a little bit difficult for us to identify specific names with the Kabbalistic tradition earlier than that, but unequivocally, there is a venerable tradition here, which I certainly am not going to come to belittle. Simultaneously, what I'll note is the manner in which the Ritva being one of the foremost heirs of the Beit Midrash of Ramban, being one of the foremost Talmidim of the Rashba, was one of the foremost Talmidim of Ramban. The Ritva famously, maybe not sufficiently famously, but should be famously, wrote a slim volume called Sefer HaZikaron for the express purpose of responding to all of Ramban's critiques of Moreh Nevuchim in Ramban's commentary on the Torah. And even says of himself, you could say, if I can render it in an English idiom, I'm sticking my neck out for something I don't even embrace, because the Ritva is definitely party to the belief in Kabbalah. Simultaneously, the Ritva, in defending Rambam, says we still need to appreciate that Rambam has a consistent system and was justified in having it, whether, and the Ritva admits two possibilities here, whether the tradition of Kabbalah is something that Rambam never heard, or that he heard it and rejected it. And the Ritva regards both those possibilities as completely acceptable. The Ritva regards both of those possibilities as acceptable, in as much as he does not by any means consider only the Kabbalistic system to be a kosher one. That's the whole purpose of Sefer HaZikaron. So again, there can certainly be a gamut of views on this score, as long as it is subordinate to the verity that we are beholden to enunciating a theology that's consistent with Torah.
The problem is if you go and if you try to repackage like what the Rama tries to do, which is very honorable, and to repackage it as actions which we in our own mental framework interpret as certain type of qualities. The problem here, and it doesn't relate to anything within God, the problem here is, at least the problem as I see it, is that could work and should work and probably would work if we're talking about 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, even as far back and maybe even 20, 30 years ago, when people didn't have much access to a lot of works like we do today. You go right now into a farm store. Every Hasidic book is not just printed, but it's printed with commentaries and annotations and footnotes. And so what happens is you have like the Ramchal, who tremendously have respect for the Ramchal. But you go into his works, you will see that there's a discussion about, right, the Sfirot as it pertains to God, right? So what I'm trying to say is that as a standalone, the Rama is a wonderful way to repackage and to put Kabbalah into a, let's just say, quote unquote, kosher light. But I worry that there's too much out there right now that get into Kabbalah too deeply, meant for the average man to read, for that to really stand.
I can't disagree with your fear. That is, I think it's critical for students first to be well grounded in the Rishonim, in particular in the theology that we learn from them, I could say through them, from Ḥazal, in order to ensure that the Kabbalistic perspective is not going to in any way draw them in heterodox directions.
Yeah.
I think I also need to stress here, there certainly is a critical line of demarcation that needs to be drawn between Kabbalat Rishonim and Kabbalat Acharonim.
Absolutely, yeah.
I'd rather not elaborate upon that. But what I certainly do feel compelled to stress is, we have no further to go than the Mishnah of Talyon in the first parak of Pirkei Avot. Chachamim hizaharu b'divreichem. Now, if on some level, not all Rishonim say this, but on some level, we could ascribe that warning, sages, be careful with what you say, even to Antigonus Ish Socho, for having bidden us to serve the master without thinking of reward, and that was misconstrued by Tzadok and Baitos, his students, to imply there is no reward and there's no such thing as the world to come, then I think it's safe to state as a Kal Vachomer, all the more so many authors over the last centuries who wrote works maybe very much along the lines of what you're proposing. Maybe they never expected these works to be broadly disseminated. And if they would never have been disseminated, they wouldn't have been this danger.
Not even disseminated, but analyzed and built upon and made readable to a layman person. It's like,
yeah, I don't know if I can justify all of these works by blaming it on the contemporary editors. I think there are works that already were very much when they were written in violation.
For sure, but I was just pointing towards the fact that today you can pretty much take any Kabbalistic sefer and get a commentary on it that will explain it to you almost like an art scroll on a Gemara.
Whose failure is that? That is the failure of yeshiva education. That does not provide students with a firm, thorough, cogent grounding in theology, in what we're supposed to believe.
Yeah.
Based upon the Rishonim.
Great point,
because if they had it.
Great point. So much focus on Gemara, Musar, which is all important. Gemara, Musar, but the fundamentals aren't. They don't.
If you don't learn the Rishonim, then how are you supposed to be? There's a little mitzvah. That's
a great point.
In Sefer Mitzvot is the first one, which is Yediat Hashem. If you don't study this.
A little point.
Little.
No, but
you on the page.
We didn't want to.
And people can construct a vision of Judaism that is categorically antithetical to the Torah. And unfortunately, it's not, they do. This is a terrible danger that we encounter today. Because people aren't grounded in understanding Torah through the prism of our Masoret. That's really what it boils down to. How is it that people understand very well that when it comes to halacha, there has to be some concept of Masoret? And you don't come up with some newfangled idea that has no grounding in our early sources. But when it comes to theology, when it comes to Yediat Hashem, they have no qualms about completely discounting our mentors, the Rishonim, and ultimately Ḥazal, because the Rishonim are explaining Ḥazal.
It's a fair point. It's a point that we've
belabored
here a lot.
If I can just stress one particular idea that is really enunciated repeatedly in the Midrash, but it is of such critical importance and unfortunately so roundly ignored. The Midrash in Bereshit Rabbah, which of course is one of the earliest Midrashic works, in Parasha 68, in paragraph 9, on Vayifga Bamakom, this is on Bereshit chapter 28, verse 11, Hu Mekomo Shel Olam Be'ein Olamo Mekomo, that we refer to God as Makom, as the place, usually translated as the omnipresent one, but literally the place, because he's the place of the world and the world isn't his place. Meaning, he is absolutely transcendent of the world, and the world, that is the entire universe, everything is entirely subsumed within him. When I say everything, I don't mean planet Earth. I don't even just mean the physical universe. I mean all of the realms that we would describe as spiritual. Everything is subsumed within Kivyachol, God, and God transcends it all. And that absolute categorical transcendence, of course, it's Maimonidean. It's not just Maimonidean. It's Ḥazal. It's Ḥazal, and everyone subscribes to this. There's no way that anyone can be faithful to Torah belief as the sages of the Midrash taught us, as the Rishonim taught us, and not appreciate this point. And this Midrash, by the way, has a huge number of cognates in other Midrashic works. I'm not going to start listing them all because I realize that would take us too far afield. But the principle that he is the place of the world, olamot felalo ve'ein hu tafel olamo, in the formulation in Midrash Tehillim on Psalm 90.
So I feel
everything
like
else is accessory. God is transcendent.
Yeah, I think that the whole idea of God being transcendent is something that people struggle to understand when it comes to like how miracles work. And we've discussed this on the podcast as well. But also like the messaging that Moshe got at Har Sinai, the experience at Har Sinai, like what exactly happened there. If it's not direct, how do we explain in on one foot, obviously, what it is that's going on? Because obviously there's no direct interaction.
So, what comes to mind perhaps most immediately with respect to that question is a discussion between the Khazar king and the Chaver in Sefer HaKuzari. That is, I already noted that Rabbi Alevi speaks of the uniqueness of Nivuah versus the concept of prophecy that is invoked by the Greek philosophers in the first treatise of Sefer HaKuzari in section 87, where he speaks at length about Ma'amad Har Sinai. The theophany at Sinai is what drummed into Am Yisrael the realization that prophecy is on a completely different level of ontology. And not at all incidentally, by consequence of this, the manner in which Rabbi Yehuda Levi casts the king, of course, Rabbi Yehuda Levi is the author of the whole shebang. He wrote both sides of the dialogue. The manner in which he casts the king responding to this description of the revelation at Sinai is anyone who hears your words will inevitably ascribe to you belief in divine corporeality. But you can't blame you either, because after all, you saw these astounding visions that were palpable. And the resounding response of the Chaver, I suspect we'll be returning to this response later on in this discussion, but the first line, God forbid that we should believe in something that is false or that the intellect rejects and regards as false. We don't believe in anything that is categorically illogical. What he goes on to emphasize is that we aren't speaking about divinity being manifest, but rather, again, the manner in which we connect with these derivatives that God has established. Whether it is that God creates an acoustical vibration in the air that we hear as the words of the Decalogue, or some other mechanism. He doesn't limit the explanation to one particular course of events, but that obviously we maintain our categorical belief in divine transcendence, and what we're affirming is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is manifest through this process, if you will, of emanations. So what does that mean? On some level, I'll say, well, whether we take the approach of the philosophers or we take the approach of the Kualim, we're going to speak in some sense in these terms. The transcendence is maintained. The Kubalim also speak about the Ein Sof. There's this dimension of transcendence, and simultaneously, there's something that we will experience in this world.
So just to end this segment, I want to just get some clarity on one point, which is, and I've asked this question, I think, to Len Goodman, but this is a question that has come up before on the podcast, which is Moshe. He writes the first 4 books of the Torah as as God's dictation, right? And it's the same person with the same mind getting the same level of nevuah. But then, what does it mean that he wrote Devarim from his own mind, from his own words? Like, how do we square that circle?
What I'll state as a 2-word synopsis of the answer is the way the Torah describes Moshe in Parashat Vezot HaBracha, Ish HaElokim, meaning what? No, that doesn't mean Chas v'Chalila, some concept of a man God. That's not Judaism. But what it does signify is that there is the potentiality for a human being to become so rarefied by his connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that he indeed becomes a faithful conduit for what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to instruct us, even if he's speaking in his own voice. On some level, that's Shechina medaberet mitoch gerono, which is also Ḥazal. So that there is some nuance of distinction between dictation, which, if anything, mandates of Moshe the utmost level of passivity, receive, and the dimension that is manifest in Mishneh Torah with Moshe as Ish Haelokim, that he, as his persona, is faithfully conveying to us Dvar Hashem. Now, ultimately, this is a singularity in Moshe, but not entirely a singularity. I say not entirely a singularity because, ultimately, I'll say that's precisely the point that the Gemara makes on the second pasuk of Tehillim in Masechet Avodah Zarah, page 19a. The pasuk reads, Ki im b'torat Hashem chevtzo u'b'torato yehegeh yomam b'layla. His desires in the Torah of God, and his Torah he articulates day and night. And of course, inevitably, the question, which grammatically is ambiguous, is his Torah, whose Torah? What's the antecedent? You could, of course, propose that the antecedent is going to be God, and we're talking about God's Torah. But the Gemara's proposition is, it starts out being described as Torat Hashem and becomes Torato, the Torah of the student who is articulating it. This ultimately is the whole dynamism of Kinyan Torah. You don't merely study Torah, you acquire Torah. You internalize Torah, you integrate Torah, you become transformed by Torah. I'll argue this is also the same principle that the Gemara enunciates in asking the question, famously in Kiddushin, page 40 at the end of the first chapter, Talmud Gadol or Maaseh Gadol, and the answer that ultimately the Gemara provides is Talmud Gadol Sha Talmud Mevi Lidei Maaseh. Talmud is greater than deed because it leads to deed. Not if it leads to deed, not to the extent that it leads to deed, not insofar as it leads to deed. If it doesn't lead to deed, it's not Talmud. What does that mean? That the only part of Torah that I should be studying is Halacha L'Maaseh? Of course not. But that true Torah is transformative. If you become a different person, obviously everything you do is going to be different because you are different. That's the quest in the integration of Torah into ourselves. So we each do it in varying degrees. Ultimately, we each pray. We pray every day, every time we say the Amidah. V'ten chelkenu b'toratecha. The one who achieved this to the utmost degree is Moshe. And to that extent, he can give us Torat Hashem, mitoch grono, which is Sefer Mishneh Torah.
Just to go back, when we finished the original question. So if I understood you correctly, what you were trying to say was you accept the fact that there has to be some sort of mechanism, that it cannot be direct, because that would be an impossibility. But so whereas the Rambam, using the philosophy of his time, and it neatly worked for him to create that mechanism, that's what he did. But now that the mechanism doesn't work, okay, so we don't use that mechanism. We just accept the fact that there's a mechanism which we won't understand or know of, but because of the logical impossibility of there not being a mechanism, we just accept there's a mechanism without fully understanding it. And
we're not going to go that way.
That's
First of all, okay, I have two.
I wanted to get it clear.
Okay, so I have two, if I may, two critical critiques of the formulation. First of all, it's not only logic; it's also masoret. Again, I reiterate the midrash.
Sure.
God transcends the world and is not consumed within it. That is integral to our belief in Torah. And anyone who claims some conception of divine immanence that violates that is enunciating some ism, but it isn't Judaism. It's not Torah. That unequivocally.
Okay.
Additionally, I'm going to again stress that what Rambam is providing us is a metaphysics that can still be cogent, even if the physics and the cosmology go out the window. So when Rambam, I reiterate, when Rambam talks about the active intellect, I have no problem enunciating the possibility. I'll say possibility because, as a case in point, Rabbi Yehuda Levi is not so big on the active intellect for a number of reasons. But nonetheless, the Maimonidean perspective of enunciating this concept of an intellectual / spiritual content of our world that is the active intellect and that serves as the mediation of spirituality coming into this world, is still a cogent possibility. I can understand what that means, and I could give a whole dissertation on what Rambam means by it. And the fact that the cosmology and the physics are obsolete doesn't make the metaphysics obsolete. Does that mean that I have to understand things in this manner? Again, I'm going to reiterate no, because indeed we find other Rishonim enunciating other formulations, but it's important for us to emphasize we aren't taking some kind of, I'm not quite sure how to describe it, but some kind of fideistic proposition that there's something enigmatic going on here and we don't know what's going on, but we have to have some cogent way of explaining to ourselves what we're talking about. If we don't have any cogent way of explaining to ourselves what we're talking about, then we're not talking about anything that can be described as Jewish belief. This is categorical, foundational. In Rambam, in particular, will stress in the first unit of the guide in chapter 50, that being able to formulate something in words is of no avail whatsoever if you don't understand what it means.
Right.
And I think I should stress here in particular that what Rambam employs as the most obvious illustration of the violation of this principle is speaking of some equation of 3 and 1 Trinitarian belief. Now, I can understand where Christians are coming from their perspective, but it's definitely not going to be admissible in Judaism. Judaism is not fideistic. The concept of belief in Judaism necessarily is something that I can explain and understand. And if I can't, if it does not make sense for me, then it's not an enunciation of belief at all. This Rambam states again in the first unit in chapter 50, but I should stress here, as perhaps one of the most important implicit, admittedly not explicit, but implicit citations of this formulation in Rambam, what Ramban presents at the end of the Vikuach. That is, at the end of the Barcelona disputation. Ramban describes in his Ma'amar HaVikuach that the following Shabbat Nachem of 1263, Pablo Cristiani, Yimach Shemo V'Zichro, and his entourage come into the main synagogue in Barcelona, and he starts delivering a dissertation, V'darash B'inyan HaShilush. And Ramban cannot keep silent here, of course, and he challenges what this conception of the Trinity is. And after the whole barrage of Ramban's critique, which is enunciated in exquisitely rational terms, Pablo Cristiani gets up and he says he believes in Yichud Gemora, complete monotheism, and nevertheless, Yesh Bo Shilush, there is a Trinity, and it's something that's so deep that the malachim and the heavenly officers, as the divine entourage, don't understand. Gets up Ramban, and without missing a beat, it is manifestly clear that a person cannot believe what he doesn't know. So according to you, then, the malachim don't believe in the Trinity either. And two-word postscript, ushtakuhu chaverav. And his Dominican colleagues shut him up because they realized he was just making more and more of a fool of himself. But that's critical. Ramban manifestly, in this line, even though he doesn't, the context didn't allow his saying, I'm getting this from Rambam. That wasn't the point. The point is manifestly clear. But clearly he's appropriating the formulation of Rambam. You cannot believe something you don't understand. So one way or another, you have to be able to enunciate your beliefs in a manner that makes sense to you. Does that mean proving it? Of course not. But it means sense. It means you know what you're saying. Not at all incidentally, and this is a critical point to appreciate. Unit 1, chapter 50 is a critically important piece of real estate in Guide to the Perplexed, because chapters 1 through 49 are on the subject of divine incorporeality, and chapters 50, one could say 51, that is the next chapter, through 70 are on the subject of divine unity. Chapter 50 is the introduction to the section on divine unity. Rambam did not feel a need to insert chapter 50 before chapter 1, because people, at least in Rambam's time, I hope that's still the case, have enough of an intuitive sense of what incorporeality means to not adulterate it with ideas that are manifestly irreconcilable with incorporeality. So he's enunciating the principle of incorporeality and applying it, of course, and understanding how to read Tanakh and so on and so forth. But he doesn't need this introduction. For the chapters on divine unity, he does. Because let's just say Christian Trinitarian belief is not the only example of a statement that is manifestly in violation of what we mean by divine unity, but could be erroneously portrayed as divine unity as long as you avoid the critical condition of understanding what you're talking about. So you need to understand what you're talking about. You always need to understand what you're talking about. And if you don't understand what you're talking about, you are not talking about anything. And you don't believe anything. So we need to make sure we know what we're talking about.
Very well said. And okay, so I just want to get more clarity on what fideism is and why Judaism, for our Christian listeners, and we have Noahide listeners as well, to understand why Judaism rejects the idea of incarnationalism.
Okay, so first, a question of definitions. If I can share a dictionary definition of fideism: reliance on faith alone rather than scientific reasoning or philosophy in questions of religion. And to exacerbate that somewhat further, if I can share another definition of fideism that casts it more in philosophical terms, it is an epistemological theory which maintains that faith is independent of reason, or that reason and faith are hostile to each other, and faith is superior at arriving at particular truths. That's a Wikipedia definition of fideism. And it's important for us to appreciate why it is wholly reasonable for classic Christianity to be fideistic and not Judaism, not Torah. And perhaps the best way to present this is by going back to one of the early church fathers, Tertullian. Now, I must note that there is a line that is commonly ascribed to Tertullian that is of uncertain origin and that he probably never said, which is, I believe, because it is absurd. So that's not going to be our evidence, because I'm not convinced that the line is in any way authentic. Simultaneously, if I may quote from On the Flesh of, which is a composition of Tertullian: the Son of God was born or crucified, depending on the version of the text. There is no shame because it is shameful. The Son of God died. It is wholly credible because it is unsound, and buried he rose again. It is certain because impossible. So it's not exactly the same as I believe because it is absurd, but there certainly is a thread here of antagonism between faith and reasoning, and embracing faith over and in opposition to reasoning. To cite one additional statement from the same composition by Tertullian: in as much as you suppose that it was within your competence to decide, it can only have been that your idea was that the God nativity is either impossible or unseemly. I answer that the God nothing is impossible except what is against his will. So then we have to consider whether it was his will to be born, because if it was, he both would be, could be, and was born. Okay, this is, again, a classic view enunciated by Christianity. We'll still need to consider why we regard this as so categorically unacceptable from the perspective of Judaism. But what it is perhaps most directly germane for us to note here, and I say this respectfully, and I've also shared these thoughts with many Christian theologian friends, I think they have agreed with me, is that there is in this regard a critical difference between Torah Judaism and Christianity, in that Christianity from its inception always had very much of a transcendentalist focus. Transcendentalist meaning that this world was really not of any great significance. The focus was on the world to come. If the focus is on the world to come and you don't really take this world too seriously, then having a set of beliefs that is incompatible with your conception of the reality of this world arguably isn't such a big problem. Because after all, the focus of your attention is not on this world. And on some level, you could even say, and this is definitely a view that is enunciated elsewhere by Tertullian and also by others, that the order, the vehemence of your faith is tested in the crucible of your embracing beliefs that you regard as absurd. Because this world really doesn't matter. And all that matters is the set of beliefs, and the set of beliefs needs to be consonant with an otherworldly realm, not this one. Again, in classic Christianity, to whatever extent Christianity is transcendentalist in its orientation, that has varied over the course of time, but nonetheless, to the extent that that is from the inception of Christianity a critical component, the bedrock of Christianity, it works. It's not going to work with the Torah. The Torah is so categorically focused upon this world, even though I can and have given a full shiur on why it is impossible to read the Torah without the presumption of everlasting life. How many places does the Torah explicitly invoke it? 0. Why not? Maybe the most cogent answer, there are several, is the one that implicitly arises in Sefer HaKuzari. It doesn't, because talking about another world would be a distraction. All that matters, as long as you are in this world, is what you are doing in this world. And otherworldly spirituality is a distraction from the spirituality of this world that needs to be coherent with this world. So what can fly in Christianity, again, we can respect as within the rubric of Christianity. I'll note that Rabbi Yehuda Levi does not in any way, anywhere in Sefer Kuzari, explicitly come out antagonistically with respect to Christian beliefs, and presents them fairly coherently in the statement of the Christian at the beginning of Sefer Kuzari. That's not going to be our set of beliefs, because that's not what Torah is teaching us.
So, being that you just explained that Judaism is not a fideistic religion, how would that play into the philosophical ideas of can God do the impossible?
Okay, this is, of course, an excellent question. And undoubtedly, the first place that we should begin here is with Rambam. This is an idea that Rambam enunciates at great length in the guide. I'll stress in particular Unit 2, Chapter 13, but even more so Unit 3, Chapter 15, where Rambam unequivocally enunciates that that which is a logical impossibility is impossible, meaning it's not real. So if you believe that God is real, then you believe that he can't be unreal in doing that which is excluded from reality because it is a logical fallacy, a logical falsity. And Rambam unequivocally states this again in these two chapters, especially in Unit 3, Chapter 15. What I'm going to stress, and this is an idea that is particularly enunciated by Rambam in the latter, in Unit 3, Chapter 15, is Rambam himself leaves something of a domain of ambiguity open, gaping. I wonder whether this gate of research is open so that all may freely enter, and whilst one imagines a thing and considers it possible, another is at liberty to assert that such a thing is impossible by its very nature, or whether the gate is closed and guarded by certain rules so that we are able to decide with certainty whether a thing is physically impossible. That's the Friedlander translation, which I think is apt in just understanding what Rambam is getting at here. And the thrust of the distinction that Rambam attempts to draw, but still is admittedly uncertain with respect to the exact placement of the line of demarcation, is that a logical impossibility is unequivocally impossible for God as well. It is impossible that God should produce a being like himself. Well, it's impossible because God is unconditional reality, self-mandated existence. Anything created is not. So by definition, God cannot produce a being like himself, or annihilate, corporify, or change himself, because that which is self-mandated existence cannot be any of those. The power of God is not assumed to extend to any of these impossibilities.
Mm-hmm.
So logical impossibility is unequivocally bound reality. Simultaneously, physical impossibilities, if you will, a violation of the law of conservation of energy, we don't regard as categorical impossibilities because we believe in the possibility of miracles. There is an author of nature. He is the sovereign over nature, and therefore miracles can take place. Exactly what the dynamism of miracles is a more complex question. I've already intimated that Rabbi Yehuda Levi considers more than one possibility in the first Mamar of Sefer Kuzari in section 89. Rambam likewise has something of a complex view of matters. We touched on this in our previous session together in Great Neck. In Rambam, in the second unit of the guide in chapter 29, we obviously aren't going to rehash that territory at present. But what we'll note, certainly as presumptive in this arena, is that which is, to our minds, a physical impossibility simply betrays our limitedness in that to which we are or are not accustomed. And doesn't necessarily constitute a categorical impossibility. A logical impossibility functions on a different plane. Rambam unequivocally argues that logical impossibilities are categorically impossible for God as well. And this definitely is a view that we see enunciated among the Rishonim. Simultaneously, I'd like to share a proposition. I'm sharing it tenuously. I can't state unequivocally that what I'm about to say is indeed the meaning of the passages I am about to cite, even though I incline in this direction. In the two passages in Sefer Kuzari, in which Rabbi Yehuda Halevi most directly addresses this point. One, we already mentioned in the first treatise in section 89. The other in the first section in section 67. Let me recast that. In the first treatise in section 67. In both of them, there is a turn of phrase that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi employs, as vindicated in all of the translations, even if I'm not reading the Arabic itself, that I think we need to consider at greater length. In the formulation in the first treatise in section 67, when Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is addressing the question of the extent to which we need to feel beholden to Aristotle, what he states is Chalila la'el shetavo Torah b'ma sheyidecher re'aya o mofet. God forbid we should believe that the Torah should encompass that which re'aya, reasonable evidence, mofet, a logical syllogism, dictates. He goes on to employ precisely the same distinction that Rambam does, that with respect to miracles and transmutation of physical nature, that's not a problem because it simply betrays our own limitedness in that to which we are accustomed. But there won't be anything in the Torah that flies in the face of logic. And in very similar terms, we already noted in the first treatise in section 89, God forbid that we believe in that which is false or that which the intellect rejects and regards as false. And of course, inevitably, the turn of phrase I'm going to stress in both of these citations is God forbid. A turn of phrase that, needless to note, is conspicuously lacking in Rambam's formulation. As well, in Rambam's formulation, it should be lacking. After all, would you ever say, God forbid, 1 + 1 should equal 3? No, 1 + 1 doesn't equal 3. There's no God forbid about it. Something that is categorically false remains false, and you don't have to say God forbid about it. And the fact that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi does invites this possibility that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi may be giving us a more nuanced perspective with respect to impossibilities and conceivably even including logical impossibilities, because Chalila la'el applies to them both. Namely, we don't have the wherewithal to be able to clearly enunciate what is or is not within the realm of divine ken, because God is beyond our ken. And to that extent, can we categorically state that our understanding of logic limits God? No, we certainly can't ascribe to God what we understand is logically an impossibility. But we can't state that this is something that necessarily circumscribes the realm of the divine in the same categorical terms that Rambam would use. But what we can state is the Torah would never ask us to believe such a thing. And this, if anything, is an even more critical statement. Because what essentially is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi stating? I'll argue. What he's stating is precisely what we said just a few moments ago, that inasmuch as the whole orientation of Torah is spirituality in this world, God, the Torah, would never place us in the intolerable position of having to live in a tension of our conception of reality and our conception of our faith being mutually exclusive. That won't work in Judaism. Again, it could work in Christianity. It can't work in Judaism. It can't work in the Torah. The Torah is all about how we live in this world. And you can't have a belief system that is going to serve as your guide for how to live in this world that is excluded by being in this world. So no, nothing in Torah is a logical impossibility. Either because, as Rambam posits, because that which is a logical impossibility is patently unreal and our beliefs are real, or because God would never demand of us believing in something that could not conform with our conception of reality.
But then why? But then why? But then some might say, then why does the Torah employ, like for instance, Avram seeing the angels? Yes, it needs reinterpretation, and we do that. But if the Torah doesn't want that, then why give room for it?
No, because again, we can unequivocally understand that. That's precisely what Ramban stresses at the end of that very long comment at the beginning of Parashat Vayera. We have an alternative way of looking at things. That alternative way of looking at things is one that Rambam definitely rejects. But what Ramban proposes is that even as Malachim are categorically incorporeal intellects, there is this concept that exists in Kabbalah and unequivocally does not exist in Rambam, that an incorporeal intellect can take on a physical garb, if you will, in the same sense that the puppeteer operates the puppet.
Right.
So you don't see the puppeteer because the puppeteer is behind the
then
scene.
it doesn't become impossible in the realm of
Exactly. And it's important for us to stress this point because Ramban is not going to say, well, we're not going to have the problem because we can believe in nonsense. No, Ramban has to give you a cogent formulation. Even if it's not going to be a formulation that's acceptable to Rambam, it's a cogent formulation to say there's such a thing as levush.
Excellent.
So if you couldn't have that formulation, you have a problem. Because then again, Ramban, after all, is the one who appropriates Rambam's formulation in the first unit, chapter 50, lock, stock, and barrel, in going to battle against Pablo Cristiani and his band of Dominicans. And it's important for us to appreciate what Ramban's agenda there is and the extent to which we necessarily must resonate with that agenda today. On the one hand, from Ramban's perspective, do we necessarily have the wherewithal to understand everything in the realm of the divine? No. And according to Rambam, we do? Of course not. Rambam emphasizes this point no less than Ramban. Just consider Rambam in the first unit of the guide in chapter 32 in warning the reader against the fallacy of thinking you have proven what you have not proven and what you are unable to prove, or thinking you have disproven what you cannot disprove, recognizing the limitations and not exceeding them, recognizing that there are ideas that are beyond our ken. Rambam understands that full well. But simultaneously, there are beliefs that we can coherently articulate as nonsensical, and those we will never be summoned by the Torah to believe, and that is categorical. And that indeed summarizes, in a nutshell, the distinction between beliefs that in Christian transcendentalism are possible and beliefs that in Torah Judaism are not and will never be.
So the miracles in and of itself doesn't play into it.
No, miracles aren't the problem because we recognize that.
Miracle's a miracle. There's no issue here.
Right. Again, the realization that a physical impossibility ultimately is not an impossibility is a reflection of that to which we are accustomed and that to which we are unaccustomed. In the same vein altogether, that obviously science undergoes revolutions when there is an accumulation of body of evidence that does not jive with the existing paradigm for understanding that science. And it's the whole foundation of Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. So I think yes, we recognize that there are phenomena that we don't understand and that will defy our facile understanding. Obviously, the case of the supplanting of one scientific paradigm by another is a purely natural process. Natural in the sense that we aren't talking about something miraculous taking place. A miracle is a different story. As we noted, we discussed this, of course, in our last segment, miracles from Rambam's perspective can be subsumed within the rules of nature, but they still are, from our perspective, categorically anomalous. We don't understand how they are natural phenomena, even if on some level they are. Physical impossibilities are not really impossibilities. From Rambam's perspective, we will state that if we can understand something to be illogical, it remains illogical because that bounds reality, period. From Rabbi Levi's perspective, again, I'm saying this conjecturally because I have no basis for definitively stating that this is Rabbi Levi's perspective as opposed to that of Rambam. But again, the turn of phrase, Chalil Ha'el, leads me to this proposition that Rabbi Levi would say, Yacholiot, could be. But the Torah would still never ask us to believe in such a thing because it is irreconcilable with our conception of reality. And our conception of reality is the critical undergirding, the critical basis of our avodah Hashem. And again, it's of course critical for us to remember. Avodah Hashem, serving God. That connection through our lives is the goal of all this. We aren't armchair philosophers engaging in abstract cogitation.
Right.
And the avodah necessarily entails having a belief system that is coherent with that realm, which is this world in which we are engaging in that avodah.
Right. So I think that the point that you've been making, and we appreciate so much all the time that you've put into elaborating all this, I think that the approach that you have been giving here is instead of trying to answer questions technically or via, pound for pound, logic for logic, yes, no, maybe. The approach that you've been giving today is that it's a matter of the focus and what our religion focuses on, right? So when it comes to can God do the impossible, maybe, maybe not. But what I think you've been saying is it's irrelevant because the Torah has wants us to be able to use sechel in order to connect to God, not to erase our sechel in order to connect to God. And therefore, trying to answer this question is sort of not the point, which is what you were trying to get at, I believe. It's not the point to try to get into a tick for tat on a academic level of whether it's possible or not possible, but rather what does Torah want of us, and then how should we approach it, regardless of where the academics plays out or doesn't play out. I think it's a very important approach. It's a very important point. I hope that the listeners understood that, and for sure this everything needs to be continued in a sense, and I'm sure we'll get to it. But I wanted to just to wrap it up with that in terms of to try to put into a few sentences what I consider to be the main ideas that you were giving out from.
If I may just disavow any credit for that, to whatever extent I hope, succeeded in conveying that point of emphasis, it is simply as a humble student of the Rishonim. We always have to keep our eyes on the ball, and they did. I'm going to reiterate what to me is just such a foundational point, that the Rishonim never wrote works of abstract philosophy. All their works of philosophy are as means to advancing us in our avodah Hashem. That sechel necessarily plays a critical role is something that none of the Rishonim at all would reject. As just a case in point, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in the third Ma'amar of Sefer HaKozari in section 19, and considering the order of the supplications of the Amidah, notes the first supplication pertains to sechel and understanding in our service of God, because through them a person is able to come closer to God. Obviously, that perspective is axiomatic and fundamental in Rambam, is a point that is so clear it would almost be an insult to elaborate upon it, because it's so obvious. It's also true in Ramban. There's the emphasis on seichel in Ramban, clearly foundational. It has a lot to do also with his whole Weltanschauung and his understanding of the Torah, the role that Ibn Ezra's commentary plays for him as the second most frequently quoted commentator in his Parashah of the Torah. Obviously, this is something upon which we can elaborate at far, far greater length. But certainly, for our purposes, the critical bottom line is to keep the eye on the ball, to recognize that we are coming into our avodah Hashem as the Bali Sechel that God has created us to be. That's not to say that we're only Bali Sechel. That's not to say that intellect is the be-all and end-all of existence. There may be different views, legitimate different views on that subject, but we never, ever toss out Sechel like the trash. It's something that will always signify, from our perspective, on the laps of the Rishonim, critical bedrock upon which we stand in our avodah, in our divine service.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was amazing. This was amazing, Rabbi Eisen. Really, you're unbelievable. We hope that we can have you on again, and we want to urge our viewers to check out your channel. If you could just quickly plug your YouTube channel.
Jewish Philosophy Matters. YouTube channel, Jewish Philosophy Matters. And of course, that's a double entendre, and I hope we are able to actualize matters as both a noun and a verb.
Amen. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Ciao, ciao.